Peter Brukner, good morning. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, Laban. Very well. All the better for talking to you.
Well, that's very nice of you to say. And I should really say Professor Peter Brukner,
No,
OAM.
just Peter's fine. That's fine. Thanks.
OMG, because I noticed it looks like you've got more letters after your name than the alphabet and more degrees than a thermometer.
Oh dear. Yeah. Well, costs a bit of money those degrees, but you can pick them up cheaply on the internet these days.
Well, I think it might have paid off, Peter, because your life is, well, from my perspective at least, an extraordinary one that you've led. And you've worked as a sports medicine physician for an awfully long time and worked with some of the world's elite sporting clubs and on a national level, certainly in Australia, Liverpool Football Club, the National Hockey and Swimming sides, the Collingwood and Melbourne football clubs, and the Australian cricket team, which as a cricketer is very close to my heart, amongst a bunch of other ones that I'm sure I haven't included in there as well.
Yeah, I've been, living the dream really, and I dreamt when I was a kid of walking out to bat at Lords and playing on the MCG and all that sort of stuff, and there was just one slight problem with that, as I didn't have any talent. So I had to come up with a plan B and find a way to get paid to watch sport. And I managed to do that. So I've been very, very fortunate with my career. Managed to work with some great teams, some great athletes. But as much as I've worked with great athletes and professional people, my some of my most enjoyable times have been just working with your average athlete or a runner or a jogger or an amateur footballer or whatever, who for whom sport is just as important, if not more so, than the person who's being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and getting them back doing what they love doing is enormously rewarding as well.
Yeah, and look, I think it's no accident that you ended up doing what you did, Peter. I really admire the work that you've done over the years, and have only sort of gotten to know you really in the last 6 or 7 months, just through the grapevine, and then had the pleasure of being able to connect with you and learn more about your background. And as a massive cricket nuffy, as I've mentioned many, many times, the work that you did with the Australian cricket team, it's not in any official memoirs yet, but I'm sure it will be. And can we basically attribute that major Ashes win to the time that you spent in the Australian cricket team?
Oh, absolutely, single-handedly. I bowled well, I batted well. No, it was a great time with the cricket team, and they're a good. They've copped a fair bit of flack over time, but good bunch of guys, good staff, good good culture. They worked hard. They got a culture of hard work, and look, they obviously had that little indiscretion in South Africa a couple of years ago, which was after I'd finished with them. I hesitate to mention, because clearly they were missing my moral guidance, but I can understand how that happened, and there's enormous pressure and stress involved with elite sport. Everyone sort of thinks, oh, great, wouldn't it be fantastic to be playing Test cricket or professional football or whatever? But it comes with a lot of, people looking very closely at you, and you really can't. You're under the microscope, and you're under a lot of pressure, and especially batsmen. Batting must be one of the, you're a batsman, Laban, are you? You're a bit of a batsman. I mean, must be one of the worst things in the world. You walk out there, and if you're playing professionally, you've got the camera on you as a walk out.
Yeah.
Face one ball, you get a dodgy decision. There out you go again. First ball duck, quack quack quack. You walk all the way back, and that's it for another week. And it's there's not many things where you only get one chance at things. If you're playing footy, you spill a mark or you miss a goal, you're there 2 minutes later. But batting is very tough, and so it's there's a lot of psychological stress on all elite sports people. But I reckon cricket's right up there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I learned an interesting number recently with regards to even the physical stresses of fast bowlers and the load that goes through their front landing leg. And some of the MRI scans that they've been able to do have shown that the shin bone, or the bone in the leg at least, has become one of the most incredibly strong bones just because of that whole repetition. Do you know much about that side of things?
Yeah. Oh, look, I mean, fast bowling. I mean, really, who invented fast bowling? It's the most ridiculous activity when you think about it. I mean, here you run up, flat out, sort of stop, pivot, and hurl the ball down, and so it's just ridiculous. I mean, when you think about it, I mean, pitching at baseball, you sort of get that. You're sort of throwing a ball. That sort of makes sense. But fast bowling, really, it's a horrendously demanding activity, and there's a very good reason why there's only been a handful of people who've ever been able to do it consistently at 150 Ks and do it well. Incredibly difficult, incredibly demanding physically, as much as any athlete, I think. And not surprisingly, their bodies break down pretty regularly.
Yeah, and I think just one of those players that springs to mind is someone that I've been a big fan of for a long time, and I know has been a dominant player in Australian cricket and overseas, playing in IPL and some of the T20 competitions as well. Shane Watson is a gentleman who you did some work with regards to some of the problems he was having. Would you mind talking us through some of the things that you got up to with him?
Oh, well, Shane's had an amazing cricket career, and but he's always struggled with injury, and he's always struggled with his weight, and maybe the two may be related. And so from an injury point of view, we sort of tackled some of his issues on a more of a sort of preventive measure, and particularly worked on his sort of back and glutes, and he had a lot of muscle, lower leg muscle strains and so on. But we seem to reduce them with working on the back and glutes and so on. But in particular, his weight. I mean, Shane loves his food, and he's always been a massive eater. I mean, you go to dinner with Shane Watson, and he has 3 main courses, and you have one. But he's got a big appetite, but he's always struggled with his weight, and the only way he's been able to control his weight was to basically starve himself, and he would, and as a result, will be miserable. And what we did was show him a way where he could eat as much as he wanted to and eat well, and yet still lose weight and control his weight. And that was with reducing the amount of carbs he was eating and increasing the healthy fats, basically going to a low-carb, healthy fat way of eating. And it made a huge difference to him. Got his weight down, but enabled him to keep enjoying his food. So he's a much happier boy.
Yeah. No, and just from a time frame point of view, what year was that you were working with Shane?
We started about 2012, 2013. Yeah. And he's still going strong now. He's still playing, IPL and other forms of T20 cricket, and he's getting on a bit now, and he's still going well.
Well, this is the thing that I was keen to discuss with you, Peter, because I'm involved still playing cricket at a Premier Cricket Club in Melbourne University, a very proud player for, it's been my 15th year next year. And there is young men who will be watching this, not just at my club, but at clubs around wherever, that are in their late teens, early 20s. And I seem to have noticed a massive influx in the last few years of young men that are seemingly in good physical shape that are breaking down with these innocuous injuries and spending months and months and months rehabbing only for it to relapse when they start playing again. What is happening? What's going on for that to happen, do you know?
Yeah, it's a good question. If we knew the answer to that, we'd solve a lot of problems, wouldn't we? Look, I think you're right in that. I think sort of, as you call them, innocuous injuries. You're probably talking about muscle strains, mild muscle strains in particular, calves and hamstrings and quads and so on.
Facet joint injuries like back.
Facet joint, low back problems. Well, certainly with fast bowlers, if we just take them as a group, I mean, I mentioned it's such an unnatural activity and does put enormous stress on the lumbar spine. And it seems that in particular, the lumbar spine does not mature properly until you're about 25 years old. It's probably the last part of the skeleton to really mature properly. And what you find in fast bowlers is that the younger ones, especially the good ones and the fast ones, invariably break down with these lumbar spine injuries. In particular, there they're a stress fracture, or what we call a pars stress fracture.
Yeah.
And it's almost a badge of honour. Pretty much every single fast bowler gets one of these injuries. Because, I know, and as a result of that, we've tried to put in guidelines for junior fast bowlers. At certain ages, you're only allowed to bowl certain amounts, and we cop a lot of flack from the old school about that. But the reality is that we know that if they overload at the ages of sort of 16, 17, 18, 19, they're going to develop these stress fractures. And even with these guidelines in place, they're still doing that. So it seems that you really can't have a big load as a fast bowler until you're 24, 25. And you look at all the current group of fast bowlers, Mitchell Starks, James Pattinson, all these guys, they all had those stress fractures in their early 20s. Pat Cummins, obviously, a classic example. And it wasn't really until they got to their sort of mid-20s that their bodies were strong enough to cope with the load. And historically, there's only been one fast bowler in Australia who's played a large number of tests before the age of sort of 23 or 24, and that was Graham McKenzie back in the 1960s, who I had the pleasure of sitting next to at Lord's last year at the World Cup. But
what did he used to eat? What was his diet like back in the day? Do you remember? Did you talk to him?
Way back in the 60s, it was pretty old school. It wasn't a lot of the way we eat now, and whether that's a factor or not, you could mount that argument. And he was in that old school of steak and eggs and fruit and veg and dairy and so on, and not too much of the processed takeaway sort of junk food that just didn't exist in the late 1950s, early 1960s when Graham was playing. But fast bowling is a hugely demanding, and it's not surprising that they get injuries. So you've really got to nurse them along until they get into their sort of mid 20s, 24, 25 before you can really load up fast bowlers.
Yeah.
But interestingly, a lot of other cricketers, non-fast bowlers, are getting these issues with hamstrings and so on. Partly, I think cricket has changed, as you know, in your 15 years of playing cricket, Laban. Cricket has changed enormously. It was a pretty sedate sort of sport back in the day, and wasn't a lot of sort of high-intensity activity, sprinting involved. Now, with initially one-day cricket, and then more recently with T20 cricket, it's quite a high-intensity sport now, and bursts of really high intensity. You're expected to, you can't just sort of lope around in the field. Everything is sort of 100 miles an hour and so on. So, it's not surprising that there are more of these injuries now than there were back in the day, I suppose.
Yeah.
And maybe we don't train well enough for it. Cricketers probably don't do enough good training, in particular sprint training. What tends to happen is you go to the nets on a Tuesday and a Thursday night. You have a bat. You might a bit of a bowl. Bowl a few spinners or whatever. You might do a bit of catching. A bit of catching in the slips or catching in the outfield. But you don't do a lot of running between the wickets at full pace. You don't do a lot of sprinting to get ground balls in the field. But then come the weekend, you have to sprint at 100% at times to make your ground, and you have to chase balls at 100%. And we're just not conditioned for that. And unless you condition your body to be used to sprinting, then you're going to be in trouble. So I think it's partly lack of conditioning in cricket that is the problem.
Yeah, look, and I think you're right. And I certainly noticed the improvements in training over the years at Melbourne University and not having played at other clubs. But in order for them to compete, they'll be doing similar stuff. Certainly throwing programs have been introduced to help preserve shoulders. A lot more of that higher intensity stuff has been led by head coach Anthony Keeley. The club won the club championship this year, and we're able to do that, I think, by limiting the amount of injury through player management, load management, that type of thing. So they seem to be maybe picking up some more of that international level training philosophy, which has been really good. And just something from an anecdotal or N=1 point of view, I used to be a fatty. I've told you some of my background and lost a significant amount of weight, but the major thing that I noticed was when I hit my mid-30s, and I'll be 40 in June in 2020. When I hit my mid-30s, I never really suffered any kind of injuries at all, but I started breaking down, and I would do hamstring strains or minor tears, quad strains. I did a facet joint injury as well, as I mentioned. And I'd miss out half the season, and I'd spend thousands of dollars on physio and chiropractic and remedial and all kinds of stuff. And the major difference for me was the removal of refined carbohydrate out of my diet, and in particular gluten. And since that time, which was 4 years ago, I haven't sustained any of those injuries at all. And the only injuries that I have picked up were during 100-kilometer ultramarathons, where I did like my iliotibial band went, because I'd run 50 kilometers further than I'd ever run before in my life, up and down hills. And I'm just curious to know why that might be. Why, if I've been able to reduce maybe the inflammation in my nutrition, is my body responding in a way that's allowing me to be the fittest that I've ever been?
Well, I think you just hit the right word then, inflammation. And we're beginning to understand more and more the importance of inflammation. I mean, everyone's known about inflammation. You have a red, hot, swollen knee, or, you get a wound that gets infected or inflamed or whatever. But it seems that there's more and more evidence of sort of low-grade chronic inflammation being the cause of a whole heap of different medical conditions, from diabetes to obesity to mental health issues and increasingly to musculoskeletal injuries, to osteoarthritis, and even to tendon injuries, tendinopathies, and maybe even for muscle injuries, as you've talked about. We don't have a lot of evidence for that, but it sort of all fits together. And so it seems that this chronic low-grade inflammation is a key to a lot of this. So what causes inflammation? Well, there's a whole bunch of things that cause inflammation. And one of which is diet, is poor diet. In particular, high levels of sugar, high levels of the omega-6 polyunsaturated oils, which are the vegetable oils that we all sort of cook in, and all sort of fast food and takeaway food is sort of cooked in. And for certain individuals, it varies. Some people will find gluten very inflammatory. Some people find dairy very inflammatory, et cetera, et cetera. Some people find certain vegetables and fruits containing lectins and so on will be inflammatory. So there's not one particular pattern. I think everyone finds sort of sugar and vegetable oils pretty inflammatory. And I think that's a major factor in injuries and in recovery. You mentioned that you're able to do all this long distance stuff now, and you recover well, and people have a lot less soreness after activity if they're avoiding these inflammatory foods, if you like. So I really promote an anti-inflammatory diet, if you like, which is very much a real food sort of a diet, and avoiding processed foods.
Well, you're an author, and you released a wonderful book, I presume it was this year or late last year, called A Fat Lot of Good.
Yep.
Which I've read cover to cover, if you can, on an iPad, and it goes into a lot more detail of what you're talking about now. But what overview can you give us of this phenomenal book that I would encourage everyone to read, by the way?
Oh, well, that's very kind of you. Well, it all stemmed. It stemmed from my own personal experience, Laban. I was 2012. I was living and working in the UK, working at the Liverpool Football Club. And if you'd asked me then, how are you, doc? You're healthy, you're well. I'd have said, yeah, I'm good. I just turned 60. I had what I thought was a healthy diet. I exercised regularly. My blood sugars were fine. I was functioning perfectly well. The reality was that I probably wasn't quite as healthy as I thought I was. And for a start, I had a family history of type 2 diabetes. My father had developed type 2 diabetes at exactly that age, and I was pretty determined not to go down that path. And I'd have done anything to avoid the shit he had to put up with. And then and I was overweight, obese, really. I was borderline obese. And like many middle-aged men, and I consider 60 middle-aged. I used to think it was old, but now I think it's middle-aged.
Just getting started, Peter.
That's right. Like, yeah, it's the new 50, as they say. Like many people of that age, I'd probably put on, half a kilogram a year for 30 years. Just slowly, just every year, just get a little bit, your belt gets a little bit tighter, and to the point where your kids are starting to, poke you in the guts and say, come on, come on, Dad, what about it?
Hey,
And I shrug my shoulders and say, well, hang on a minute, I'm on a good diet, I'm on a low-fat diet, I exercise, it's not my fault. So, and I'd had a condition called fatty liver for a number of years, which I'd ignored, like a typical doctor. I'd ignored, and I didn't really understand it. And I figured I was on a low-fat diet, so I'd ignore that. I had high triglycerides, so in retrospect, I was clearly pre-diabetic. I mean, I was well on the way to following in my father's footsteps, and by now I'd certainly be a fully fledged diabetic if I hadn't changed. And around that time, I started to hear a few whispers that there were some colleagues of mine, in particular a guy called Professor Tim Noakes in South Africa, who's an old friend of mine, who was suggesting that maybe we'd got this whole diet thing wrong, and maybe it was carbohydrates that were the problem, was not fat. Because, as you know, we'd all been on this low-fat diet for 40 years, the whole of Western society, and, we'd switched from butter to margarine and low-fat milk and, all that sort of stuff. Anyway, I'd been doing all that religiously like everyone else. And so I took note of this, and because Tim Noakes is a super smart guy, probably the smartest guy I've ever come across, and he'd challenged a few, sort of long-standing thoughts in sports science previously, and always been proven right. And but I must admit, I thought this time, no, he'd really lost his marbles. What do how can you suggest that the whole world has been wrong for the last 40 years? Because Tim had developed type 2 diabetes himself, despite being a avid marathon runner and a super fit guy, and couldn't work it out. And so he read some stuff and came to that conclusion, and basically reversed his diabetes himself by just going on this low carb diet. And so I heard about this, and I thought, oh, that's weird, So I thought I needed to read some, I needed to find out more about this. So I read a book by Gary Taubes, an American author, called Good Calories, Bad Calories, and this book just blew me away. I mean, it just freaked me out in a way, because it talked not only about the sort of relative merits of fats and carbs, but it talked about the politics of how the low-fat movement had won out over the low-carb movement way back in the 60s and 70s, which I'd always assumed was on the basis of, good science and eminent sort of, and turned out to be very dodgy science and all about money and politics and the US agriculture industry. And I remember going to bed at night after reading this book, and I'd be thinking, no, this couldn't be right. Like, we couldn't have had this so wrong for all this time.
Wow. And
the more I read, the more I thought, my God, So I thought, okay, it's time for some science. Okay, now I'm a scientist. It's time for an experiment. But as a scientist, you also know that experiments with an n equals 1 are a waste of time, except when the 1 is you. So I decided it was time for an n equals 1 experiment on myself to find out about this low-carb diet. So day one, I got all my bloods done, and sure enough, high triglyceride, fatty liver, all that sort of stuff. And then I went on this low-carb, healthy fat diet. I decided to do it for 3 months, 13 weeks. And so I stopped all the sort of sugars and starches, no more pasta, rice, bread, potato, soft drinks, fruit juices. What else did I went, back to butter from margarine. And I basically went back to eating the way that probably my grandparents had eaten. So lots of fresh fruit and veg, meat, fish, dairy, full fat dairy, eggs, been demonized for years, full of cholesterol, all those, egg white only omelets. Horrible, tasteless, horrible stuff. Anyway, so I went back to eating that way. The only fruit that I had was berries, and I had nuts and seeds and so on. So I decided to do that for 3 months, and I was pretty strict. I went, I was determined to do it. So the first thing I noticed was that I stopped being hungry. It was quite dramatic. I mean, I used to have my cereal for breakfast, and then by 11 o'clock in the morning, I'd be starving. I'd say, you know, must be lunchtime soon. Where's a muffin? Where's a cereal bar or whatever?
Yeah.
Terrible. So instead, I'd have, you know, eggs and bacon or a full fat yogurt and some nuts and berry, and I just wouldn't be hungry all day. And I just couldn't believe it. I went from eating 3 meals and 3 snacks a day to probably eating 2 meals a day. If ever I got a bit peckish during the day, I'd just have a handful of nuts or some cheese or something like that, and I was fine. So that was the first thing. And then I started to feel better and feel more energetic. My running got better. My concentration was better, and I kept losing weight. You know, every week I'd weigh myself every Monday morning, and you know, first week I lose a kilogram. You think, oh yeah, that's, you know, a bit of fluid and beginner's luck and so on. Every week I just kept on losing, and which is really motivating because, you know, you're feeling great, and every week you get on the scale, say, hey, I'll keep doing this.
Yeah.
So at the end of the 13 weeks, I lost 13 kilograms.
In 13 weeks, 13 kilos in 13 weeks.
I was never hungry. I ate really well the whole time, and felt great. And then I got my bloods done, and my insulin levels had come back to normal. My triglycerides were down to normal. My fatty liver that I'd had for 10 years had disappeared. Completely normal fatty liver results. Unbelievable.
Wow.
So ironically, I got rid of my fatty liver by eating more fat. And it was just so hard to get your head around. I mean, because we've been told for 40 years, fat is bad. And all of a sudden, trying to get your head around the fact that you're allowed to eat full fat dairy and eggs, and you don't have to trim the fat off your meat and things. That was the hardest thing.
Yeah.
I really struggled with that. But got used to it, and you saw the results. And so I was, you know, I just blown away by this. And I also found it quite confronting because it confirmed what I'd been reading, that we actually had things wrong all this time. And yet 99.999% of other members of the medical profession and all the experts are still pushing this idea that fat is bad and that carbohydrates are good. And that really worried me. So I think when you make a discovery like that about yourself, you've got two choices. You know, you can either just say, great, you know, I'm feeling really good, I'm just going to keep going like this and, you know, stuff everyone else. Or you can say, well, you really had a duty almost to sort of talk to people about it and try and spread the word. And I guess, you know, as a doctor, your philosophy is that you're trying to help people and you're trying to make people healthier and better. And I discovered a way of doing that. And I felt sort of what was my duty, really, to my responsibility to get out there and spread the word. And so really I started talking, giving talks and writing stuff and everything. And then, you know, I was sort of doing a lot of that. And then a couple of years ago, Penguin, the publishers came to me and said, you know, would you like to write a book? And I sort of said, nah, look, really, you know, the last thing the world needs is another bloody diet book. You know, I mean, go to a shop and there's hundreds of them. And I guess they convinced me that there were very few by doctors and none by Australian doctors, and that you know, I had a bit of a profile, and so that might help get the message out there. So they convinced me it was a good idea to get the message out there. And you know, by and large, you know, it probably was a, you know, in retrospect, it was a good idea. The interesting thing was that I wrote the book in 3 weeks. I just wrote it, wrote this, you know, 200-page book in 3 weeks. It was amazing because obviously I had it all in my head, and I'd been collecting, you know, lots of articles and lots of literature over the years. So I had everything there, and I clearly, you know, knew what I wanted to write, and I just sort of wrote. I just went down the beach. We had a little shack down the beach in the middle of winter, and no one else was around, and the highlight of my day was going down the coffee shop and getting my takeaway coffee, and that was about it. And I just wrote 16 hours a day for 3 weeks, and got it done. And,
wow, like the Forrest Gump of writing.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm a terrible typist too, so you know, it wasn't great, but anyway. So it was really the message I wanted to get out there, that you know, that real food is the right way to go, that everything we've been told really for the last 40 years is probably wrong, and we've got to rethink things, and particularly, you know, the processed foods with sugars and grains and vegetable oils are
Yeah.
bad news, and probably the reason we've just been getting fatter and sicker ever since. I mean, it's amazing, really, because in the last 40 years, every year, the statistics show we've got fatter and sicker. And yet, you'd think in that time, people would say, well, hang on a minute, maybe we're doing something wrong. But oh no, everyone just sort of keeps going along the same old way and just seem to accept the fact that, we get fatter and sicker, and that, 2 million people in Australia have got diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and a third of Australia has got fatty liver, and 4.2 million Australians have cardiovascular disease, and all these sort of things. We just sort of shrug our shoulders and say, oh, well, that's life. And yet there's a good reason why this happened. And these things are reversible. That's the amazing thing is, and we've shown now that, a disease like type 2 diabetes, which is so common and the cause of so many problems with eyes and heart and kidney and feet, is actually reversible. I mean, it's really exciting. And yet the majority of doctors still are not aware of that, and still just hand out tablets and say, we can't fix this. We'll just have to try and control it as best we can. And yet, there's evidence now that with a low-carb diet, we can reverse type 2 diabetes. So all these sort of things make me very passionate and enthusiastic about trying to get the message out there, and the book and the talks that I give and the YouTubes and so on. And now, of course, this podcast, which will be massive, I'm sure. And so that's what I'm trying to do these days with my career. I'm sort of winding down the sports medicine part of my career. I don't work full time with any teams anymore. I finished with the cricket team 2 or 3 years ago, and just do a little bit of part-time consulting now. But my passion now really is nutrition and getting people to eat better. We've started a charity a couple of years ago called SugarByHalf. The aim of reducing the amount of added sugar in Australia by a half. I mean, the average Australian has about 16 teaspoons a day of added sugar. 16 teaspoons a day. And the World Health Organization, for all its problems, suggests a maximum of 6 per day, really. And so we're way too high. So we're one of our aims is to try and get that sugar levels down. Sugar is not the only thing, but it's a big factor. And if we can reduce the amount of sugar down to those WHO levels, it'll have a massive impact on the health of Australians. So we're working pretty hard at that.
Yeah, and I'd like to explore this in a little bit more detail in a minute. I think the numbers around sugar and even added sugar in any form, in my opinion, it's an unnecessary nutrient. It's not even I don't know if nutrient's the right word for it. For the viewers and the listeners, I'm currently day 16 of doing an N=1 experiment. I have eliminated like every single plant matter out of my diet. I'm only eating meat, water, and a couple of black coffees a day. And I have had 3 small teaspoons of raw honey over the course of the period already, and have been doing my blood work with a digital ketone meter and a digital blood glucose monitor as well, and have been tracking my health for a long time. And forever, my fasting blood sugar has been between 5.7 to 5.9, even as high as low 6s, which put me in that pre-diabetic state.
Yep.
And since I've been adopting this, low carb or zero carb almost, my fasting blood sugar sits between 3.9 to 5. In fact, it brought a 5.6 reading just early this morning after a fasted run. So I ran with no food, no water, no coffee. And how come I haven't died?
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's the traditional teaching, is that, if you don't have fruit and vegetables, you get scurvy, you die, all that sort of stuff. And the growing carnivore movement is proving that to be a fallacy, and that people seem to be doing very well. Certainly, some people, particularly those with autoimmune disease and so on, seem to be thriving on a carnivore diet. It's not for everyone, obviously.
Yeah.
But But as you say, you know, traditional teaching says that we should not be able to survive on a carnivore diet because there's very little vitamin C, for instance, and other sort of vitamins. But it seems that when you do eat carnivore, the theory is that your need for some of those vitamins is markedly reduced, and that's why you can do so well on it. So it's fascinating. It's really you know, changing the whole way we think about food and about our priorities. As I said, I don't think carnivore's for everyone. I think, you know, there's certainly huge advantages to low sugar, and carnivore is probably the ultimate low carb diet. But the majority of people don't need to be that strict. But you know, I've had many people in a similar situation to you who've tried different things and thrive on a carnivore diet, which is really quite confronting as a doctor. I mean, it's against everything that we've really been taught. But proof of the pudding. Some people will say, well, you know, you've only been on it for a few months and so on, but there are people out there who've been on it for a long, long time and seem to be still continues to do well. So yeah, it's really interesting, and we're going to have to. You know, I think there's a lot more. We need to start doing some more research on the carnivore diet because there's been very little done. That's a problem with nutrition research in general. I mean, the quality of the research is really poor, and it's very hard to get funding for research. You know, it's the two bodies that fund medical research are the drug companies. Well, they're not interested in it, and then the government. You know, it's against all the dietary guidelines. So you know, we can't possibly fund that. So the trouble is, the dietary guidelines need to be updated somewhat.
Well, and this is what I was going to ask you about. So, I'm not qualified as a doctor or as a nutritionist, so I don't have to abide by the guidelines that are dictated. But medical professionals do. The army do when they're distributing nutrition. Hospitals do when they're delivering nutrition for patients. Schools are all guided by this law of nutrition. So how do you manage that as a medical professional when you've stumbled across this information and it totally contradicts everything that you were told is true?
Yeah, well, that's a huge problem for people like myself who don't believe that the guidelines are appropriate. And one way of doing that is that we, you know, obviously the next time the guidelines are revised, we'll be doing our best to make sure they get changed. But there's a lot of people have a vested interest in the current guidelines. You know, from the food industry to the medical profession to the dietetics profession, you know, they've all been living off these guidelines for the last 4 years. Fortunately, now there's an increasing amount of research which now shows that the low carb approach is beneficial, and in fact more beneficial than the low fat approach. And with more and more of that research coming out, and particularly in diseases such as diabetes, I think that's the most exciting research that we're seeing now, is that these low carb programs are actually putting type 2 diabetes into remission, which is really exciting stuff. I mean, it's such a common disease with such horrendous sort of sequelae and different areas leading to death. And the fact that we've now shown that you can reverse that type 2 diabetes with a low carb diet is really exciting. And more doctors and more patients, you know, are actually driving this because they're hearing about it, they're trying out a low carb diet, and lo and behold, they're getting off their diabetes medications and they're getting back to normality. So that's slowly getting out there. I wish it was more widely understood and more widely known. I'm doing my best to spread the word, but not that many people listen to me. Thank you for having me on. But
they will, Peter. They will. Don't you worry about that.
It's a message that we need to keep getting out there. Unfortunately, as I said, there's a lot of people out there who don't want that message to get out there, who've got a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. You've got to remember, it took us 30 years to convince people about tobacco. Yeah. It's probably going to take us 30 years to convince them about sugar because of the vested interests that are involved.
Yeah, look, this has become, you mentioned, you know, that responsibility to be able to, what do I do with this burden of knowledge? And it's an unstoppable force within me now. I have experienced far too much of my own extraordinary health benefits, certainly in the last 4 years. And to run some numbers, I've lost, at this point, 26 kilos of body fat. I've put on 8 kilos of muscle mass. And you can test my bones, do your isotope readings, test my steroids, whatever. I've not taken any exogenous testosterone or any of this stuff. It's just purely meat and water. And like 99% carnivore for the last 2 years, just going hardcore strict for the last 2.5 weeks. But I got DEXA scans done when I very first cut out bread or refined, carbohydrate and gluten. And I got one 3 months later, and I lost 3.5 kilos of visceral body fat. All of that nasty stuff that was packed around my organs. And I'm sure you would agree that's some of the worst fat for the human body in terms of affecting things like non-alcoholic fatty liver syndrome and type 2 diabetes. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, I think visceral fat, the fat around our organs in our stomach, is the real nasty fat. And interestingly, what we understand now is that fat is actually inflammatory. So the fat cells secrete inflammatory cytokines. So they are part of the cause of this inflammation. So it explains the link really between obesity and all these different diseases, in that the fat cells contribute to this chronic inflammation that's the underlying source of so many of our health problems. So yeah, if you can reduce your visceral fat in particular, then that is enormously beneficial to your health. No doubt about that.
Yeah. And I think some of the fight back that I get, and I've worked very hard not to try and tell anyone what to do. And I'm like, bugger you, I'm just going to lead by example as much as I can. People always say, and this is just a limiting belief of their own, that there's so much information. What do I believe? The animals, like we're supposed to go plant-based or whatever. What's a simplified way of just going, this is how you do it?
Well, I think the simplest way to look at it is to eat real food. If you can avoid anything that's processed or in a packet or in a can or anything like that, and just stick to real food, then you won't go far wrong. And that real food can be a whole variety of different things. It can be meat and fish, but it doesn't have to be meat and fish. It can be vegetables, it can be fruit, it can be dairy, it can be nuts and seeds and so on. Just, we've got to remember that 80% of processed foods have added sugar. Most of them have added oils, they have preservatives, they have emulsifiers. I mean, they're hardly worthy of being called food, some of these things. They're chemical concoctions. They have 30 ingredients. I mean, that's not a food. That's a chemical concoction. And we just don't need that. Now obviously, processed carbohydrates and polyunsaturated fats and all those things combined. And the big advantage is it's very cheap. I mean, if you want to eat cheaply, you go to Macca's every night. It doesn't get any cheaper than that. But ultimately, we pay the price down the track with our health. And and I think that's the message that we've got to get across to people. That we can eat cheaply, but ultimately, it's going to cost us in the long run.
Yeah, and there's huge amounts of waste associated with this stuff as well. And I'd like to say that this way of eating that I've been eating specifically the last 16 days, I haven't thrown away a single thing. All the leftover bones from the T-bones go into the freezer and are made into a bone broth stock, which I then reduce down and drizzle over my beautifully cooked steak. It's one of the greatest things I've ever put in my mouth, Peter. And in terms of like some of the benefits of taking your nutrition and your life back into your own hands and becoming your own superhero, increased energy and vitality and that lifting of brain fog that you talk about, and the drive to get up every morning and go and exercise. And people say to me, yeah, but Laban, you're an exercise nut. I firmly believe, and I wasn't. I've only started running in the last 2 years, and I wasn't. And the reason I firmly believe that this has happened is that I have this force, this energy that courses through my veins on a daily basis that propels me to move my body in the same way that our ancestors would. And I get antsy if I don't do something every day. And I've gone from averaging, 13,000 steps a day to about 21,000 steps a day. I can't help it.
Yeah. It's interesting because people say you've got to exercise to lose weight. I actually think you've got to lose weight to exercise.
Yeah.
And once you do lose weight, as you say, you feel you got so much energy. You feel as though you want to be doing things. It's quite remarkable. I used to hate exercising. Even though I was into sport and everything like that, I love playing sport, but I'd hate just doing exercise for the sake of it.
Yeah.
Now I exercise every day and look forward to it and enjoy it. And just because I think I've lost that weight and I've got so much more energy and so on. So yeah, it changes your life. There's no doubt about it. And I know, people keep saying that, oh, it's changed my life, but that's the reality. I mean, I have people come up to me in the street, people send me emails, send me text messages, oh, thank you so much. You've changed my life. And I thought, oh, no one ever said that when I fixed their knee or their ankle or whatever back in the day. I mean, and it's amazing. It really does change people's lives. And that sounds very melodramatic and, big noting and all that sort of stuff. But, that's the way it is. And as a doctor, it's so rewarding. I mean, it's just to know that you've had this effect on people. You might have reversed their diabetes, or they've lost weight, or they've helped their mental health. That's another interesting area, mental health and nutrition and so on. I mean, that's incredibly rewarding for me as a practitioner to know, because basically that's why you do medicine. That's why you become a doctor, because you actually want to make a difference and make people better. And in all the years, in the 40 years I've been practicing as a doctor, this is really the thing that's made the biggest difference to my patients. And that's why I'm passionate about it, and I want to spend the rest of my professional life anyway, and doing everything I can to promote this concept.
Yeah, well, you've nailed it with that mental health side of things, Peter. That's one of the major things. If someone actually held a gun to my head and said, you must pick one of all the many benefits that you've received from adopting this eating protocol, this lifestyle, it'd be the mental health. And as someone who never really battled with mental health that I was aware of, not in the traditional anxiety or depression, that kind of thing, I've always had a pretty good disposition about myself. But certainly in my mid-30s, coincidentally when my soft tissue injury started happening, my mental health, the day after, having a few beers the night before, as a recreational drug user on occasion, it would take a week or so to recover from that. And having eliminated all of that stuff out of my diet now, and as someone who suffered from an autoimmune disease, I had GERD for 17 years, which I was on medication for, there's something happening in my stomach that's really interesting. It's been happening for a couple of years, and it's in the last 16 days. It's starting to course through the rest of my body. And I think from a biological point of view, we know now that most of the dopamine, serotonin that the body generates comes from within the gut. And it sounds woo-woo and it sounds whatever, but my mental health for the last 2 years has been 10 times better than it's ever been. And it's coincided into me being the most productive that I've ever been in the last 2 years. And I foster better interpersonal relationships, and I attract better people into my life, people that want to lift you up. And you start to sort of go, woo, woo, woo. But it's had such a profound effect on my own life that I'll be damned if I'm going to change the way that I'm doing this. And you can pull that steak out of my cold, dead hands if you're going to try and ban it. So, this is just N equals 1, but I'm not the only one that's experiencing this kind of crazy stuff.
No, I think that the mental health issue is a really interesting one, and there's increasing evidence now of the effect of diet on mental health. And there's been some great work done down at Deakin University here in Victoria, and they've looked at the effect of diet on depression and anxiety, and found that improving your diet, going on to a Mediterranean type, low-carb type diet, can have a dramatic effect on as good, if not better, than any medications that you might go onto. And it seems probably that mental health may well be a disease of chronic inflammation as well, chronic inflammation of the brain. I had an interesting experience a couple of weeks ago. I was in the coffee queue at university where I do a little bit of work, And a girl came up to me and said, "Oh, Dr. Brukner." I said, "Yeah." She said, "Oh, I enjoyed your lecture the other day." I said, "Oh, that's nice." And she said, "Oh, but that's not what I want to talk to you about." And I thought, "Oh God, what have I done here?" And she said, "Oh, my husband and I are massive cricket fans, and because of you in 2014, we went onto a low carb diet, and my husband's been bipolar all his life, and he's now off all his medication, and you've changed our lives, and I just want to say thank you."
Wow.
I thought,
Wow.
wow, I mean, to have that effect just on one person makes it all sort of worthwhile. And it just shows that, changing diet can have a massive impact on so many different areas that, to be honest, I would not have believed. If you told me this 10 years ago, I'd have thought this is the biggest load of crap I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah.
Get some science. You don't know what you're talking about. Medicine knows these things, and, we can't have been wrong all this time. And this has just blown me away. I just would never have believed it. I was the most traditional conservative doctor. Doctors basically believe everything we're taught in medical school, and we keep that belief until we die. And I've now realised that half of everything we get taught in medical school turns out to be wrong. We just have to work out which half. And I'm starting to work that out now. So really, people who know me just can't believe that this very traditional conservative doctor has become, seemingly quite radical and alternative. But to me, it's just very obvious, both from my own experience, from other people's experiences that I know, and from everything I've read. I read everything there is to read about diet. I probably spend 2-3 hours a day reading journal articles, newspaper articles, you name it. I'll read it, all the crap stuff, all the good stuff.
Yeah.
And the more I read, the more convinced I am that we've just got it so wrong and we've got to change.
That's so great, Peter, and we are very thankful and blessed that you are on this crusade. And I tell you what, some people aren't quite so benevolent about this whole link between food and mental health. And I'll share with you a story of something that happened to me late last year. I took a short-term contract as working in recruitment with a company that shall remain unnamed for the sake of this story. Let's just say they were quite a large super fund that started with C. And I'd been there for about 4 weeks, and because of my diet, quite often I would sit in the cafeteria and eat my 1 to 2 meals a day, which might be piled high full of steaks or meat patties or whatever it might be. And so, not surprisingly, people would come up to me and say, "Hey, what's going on there? Like, I thought this stuff was supposed to kill you." And if people ask me, I'll happily tell them anything they want to know. And I had multiple conversations with many of my colleagues at this time. And I got pulled into a meeting room a couple of days before my contract was due to end. And my manager at the time said to me, "I'm sorry, Laban, we've had a formal complaint." And I said, "Oh, wow, like, what for?" And she said, and I quote, Peter, she said, "Someone that you were in a conversation with took offense to the fact that you linked mental health and nutrition together." And I said, "Can you just repeat that back to me?" And she said, so I made sure.
Oh, that's right.
And they were very, very specific about saying that I wasn't being fired, but my contract was being concluded early. And then after all the formalities were done, and I could clearly see that this person was quite stressed by having to deliver this news to me. And I had no idea who the person was. And I said to her, "Do you know what?" She said, "What?" I said, "I'm right." And she just had a big wry smile come onto her face. And I grabbed my things and I walked out of there and I went, holy God, this is what we are up against in this fight to try and get people feeling how we've evolved to feel.
Yeah, it's scary, isn't it?
Isn't it extraordinary?
Oh, well, their loss.
So, but you know what? It's just empowered me to continue the fight. Like, I'm just, the can's open. The can's open, and I've spoken to you about a gentleman that I'm working with at the moment. I do some accountability coaching, and in the process of getting to know this particular gentleman. He's got a very, very pronounced stutter and has had all his life. And we were able to get comfortable enough to a point where we were discussing it, and I asked him whether he might be interested in hearing or seeing or reading some information, some anecdotal stuff only, with regards to some people that have had success in improving their own cognitive function and speech through the adoption of a low-carb diet. And there's certainly been some medical literature around therapeutic ketogenic diets for seizures and epilepsy. Is that a fair thing?
Yeah, well recognised. Yep.
And so we've been recording our video sessions, and it's been 2 months. He's adopted a carnivore diet. He's been about 97% strict. He's had the occasional cheat meal here and there, but it'll be really interesting to see what the result of that is, because he's agreed to do a 15-minute keynote at one of my talks later in 2020. So to talk about stuttering, and I'm not coaching him to try and cure the stuttering, but wouldn't it be interesting if it improved his stuttering? Like, what else does it affect?
Yeah, and people look at you a bit strangely, because it does affect so many things. But you sort of think, oh, maybe I shouldn't say that. But I think the low carb fixes everything, but it doesn't fix everything. But it sure as hell fixes a lot of things. And so yeah, I can see people thinking, oh, that crazy Brukner guy thinks it does everything. But it just never ceases to amaze me that people come and say, oh, you talked about your GERD, your digestion problems, mental health, Parkinson's disease. A friend of mine's dad had Parkinson's disease, and he rang me and said, "Can you do anything about my dad? He's just staring at the wall. He used to swim a kilometre a day and walk the dog every day, and so now he just sits on the couch and stares at the wall." And he actually said, "Can we get him on the low carb diet?" I said, "Yeah, let's try it." And the dad himself rang me a few months later and said, "I just want to say thank you." I said, "What for?" He said, "Oh, I swam a kilometre yesterday, and I'm back to doing everything I used to do." My son rang me and said, "Yeah, we actually think he's a nicer person than he was before he started." But things like that. It's so many different conditions seem to be helped by removing all these inflammatory dietary components and getting into a sort of a pure, real food sort of diet. Because so much of this stuff wasn't around 2 generations ago. In my grandparents' generation, they didn't have a lot of these issues. And what's changed? Really, the only thing that's changed is diet. People keep saying, "Oh, we're exercising less." Well, we're not actually exercising less. Well, you aren't anyway. But we're exercising about the same as we did a generation or 2 ago. In those days, it was more work-related. Now it's more leisure-related. So what's really changed is food, in particular processed and ultra-processed foods. And that's a big change, and that's been a disaster. And we've just got fatter and sicker for 40 years, and enough's enough.
Yeah, you're right, Peter, and I love that you share these stories, and I hope that people are listening to this and it's piquing their interest. It's challenging at times when you don't have a banner of a medical professional or whatever. So it's really empowering to see someone with such an illustrious medical background talking about this stuff so openly, and the impact that this will have probably won't be realized until long after we're gone. And I certainly see you, and I know that you're part of the Low Carb Down Under fraternity as well, which are a global network of like-minded individuals. I know there's a bunch of talks that have been postponed due to the current lockdown situation. Is there anything that's planned major that's of interest that you're going to be involved with in the coming weeks, months, or years?
That's there's a lot of stuff happening. I just did a conference presentation yesterday, recorded it for a lifestyle medicine conference in a couple of weeks' time. Paul Mason, who you mentioned before, is putting together a low carb online conference for June. So I'll let you know that, and you can let your listeners know about that. And I'll be speaking at that, and Tim Noakes and a whole bunch of people will be producing an online conference then. So that's the short-term exciting activities, and SugarByHalf continues to be pretty active in all the things we're doing and so on. So, plenty to keep you busy.
And just on that sugar by half, for anyone in the corporate game that's interested to know a little bit more, explain just what we're hoping to achieve with the sugar by
Well,
half.
we've got a number of different programs, but one of which is our corporate program that we've just launched. Well, we're supposed to be in the middle of our first corporate program now, but that's been postponed. So that's basically a program where we go into a company, really give them as much as they want, but generally some initial talks to the staff, and then we've got a 6-week program that we called Hit Sugar for 6, and which is with a booklet and lots of online activities and support for people who want to tackle their health and to reduce the amount of sugar and processed food that they have. And that's a pretty exciting program. And any businesses that would like to take that on, they can contact me at SugarByHalf, Peter at SugarByHalf.com. So we'll be happy to talk to them about that.
Brilliant. And I'll link that down in the description box below for all the YouTube viewers as well. And Peter, I'm very conscious of your time. You are a busy man saving the world one low carb person at a time. But there's one particular thing that I'd really love to know. You've been the sports medicine doctor on a couple of Olympic Games, and you were directly involved with the year that Cathy Freeman won her gold medal and were her personal doctor, from what I understand. Can you share that story with us, please?
Oh, well, yeah, that was a pretty amazing event. I was actually the team manager of the athletics team in Sydney. I'd been the doctor the previous time, and they promoted me or demoted me, or whatever the case may be. And so it was, I mean, the whole Sydney Olympics was an amazing experience. And but Cathy, it was a unique time, really. I mean, I'm a bit of a historian, a student of the Olympics, and I believe that there's never been anyone in the history of the Olympics who's been under as much pressure to win a gold medal as Cathy Freeman was in Sydney. For those old enough to remember, you'll remember that she was really the face of the games. She was probably our only realistic gold medal chance in the biggest event of the games in athletics. She was a current world champion. And, she was female, she was Indigenous. And, in case anyone didn't think there was pressure on her, then let's get her to light the flame at the opening ceremony. Just really sort of ramp up the pressure a little bit more. So, enormous pressure on her to do that. And quite remarkable the way that she managed that pressure. I don't think there's too many people in the world who would have coped with that pressure. She had this amazing ability to sort of tune out and just sort of just to go back into her own little world and just let the rest of the world sort of pass her by. And a lot of then used to annoy people, and they'd say, "Oh, she's a bit vague," or she's but that was just her way of coping. She went into her inner circle, and she had some really good people around her supporting her, particularly her coach Peter Fortune and others. And she was amazing the way she handled it. And then when she came out on the track that night, in her suit, which had never been seen before, and you think as the manager of the team, of course, I would have known all about that suit, but clearly I wasn't very important because I knew nothing about it. I've got one sitting on my wall here, but I certainly knew nothing about it beforehand. But and she managed to win that gold medal. It wasn't in her fastest time ever or anything like that, but it was a great run, and it was good enough to win. And then again, some people will remember that what happened afterwards, because most times when you win an Olympic gold medal, if you're Usain Bolt, you prance around, you jump up and down, and you grab a flag, and you're posing, doing his poses and things like that for the media and so on. But what did Cathy do? She sat down on the track, put her head in her hands, and just sat there. And I remember, I was just past the finish line myself, and I was thinking, "Come on, get up, Cathy, get up, come on, get going." And she seemed like she sat there for hours. It was only probably 30 seconds, but it was just so overwhelming for her, I think. And then one of my jobs was to basically look after the athletes after they finished and take them through, media and drug testing and, all that sort of stuff. So I was basically Cathy's minder then for the next 3 or 4 hours afterwards, which was pretty amazing experience. You take her through media, and then up to be interviewed by Bruce, and then in to see her family, and then get ready for the medal ceremony, and then down to drug testing. And I remember sitting in drug testing and thinking, this is the most bizarre experience. The whole country is going crazy. You've had all these Freeman parties. It was Freeman night, and there's all these Freeman parties everywhere, and people are celebrating. And here am I sitting there with this little girl, we're just chatting away about where we're going to go on holiday after the Olympics and things like that. And I'm thinking, this is the most bizarre experience that, and I felt so privileged that, here was I sitting there with Cathy while she was the hero of the country. And it's been voted Australia's greatest sporting moment ever. And I was very fortunate enough to be there. I actually had the gold medal in my pocket for about 3 hours,
Wow.
And it can be a bit vague. I thought maybe I could get away with it, but no, back in the end. But I caught up with Cathy recently, and we had a bit of a laugh about all that, and reminisced about those experiences and so on. So it was lovely to be able to share that with her. And she's an amazing person. And as I said, I don't think there's anyone else in history who's been under as much pressure as her. And the fact that she was able to cope with that was just unbelievable. So very special day in my life and the life of Australian sport, really, and obviously in Cathy's life as well.
Wow, what an extraordinary story, Peter, and thank you for sharing that. Peter's book is A Fat Lot of Good, available online and in all major bookstores, Peter? Not that anyone can get there.
Oh, absolutely. I think probably online, mainly. Might be on those remainder, half-price remainder.
The book grocer. So I'll attach some links through for all the stuff that we've talked about. It's been an absolute pleasure, an absolute delight, and I would love to revisit this, and I'll bring my full panel of blood and lipids and testosterone and thyroid and B12 that I've got taken last week, and I'll be happy to break those down with you, Peter. If there's anything you'd like to say before we go, I'm happy to wrap this up.
No, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure meeting you, getting to know you over the last few months, Laban, and look forward to trying to spread this word in the future.
Have a blessed day, everybody.